What's up, you guys? So in this video, I wanted to discuss the concept of speciation, which is when one species ultimately diverges into two species. But before I get into that, we must first have a working definition of the term species. If I were to ask you to define the term species, you might run into some difficulty. You might say that different species look different from one another, but this is not necessarily the best way to differentiate between species. For instance, the eastern meadowlark and western meadowlark look remarkably similar, but are actually two distinct species. Furthermore, different breeds of dogs might look very different from one another, but are actually the same species. We therefore more appropriately define a species as a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. In other words, members of the same species need to be able to A. reproduce, and B. make offspring that can also reproduce. But how then is it possible for one species to become two? Well, we know that interbreeding links members of the same species. So all we have to do to cause one species to diverge into two species is to stop interbreeding from occurring between two populations. In other words, at least two subgroups of the species need to be reproductively isolated from one another. As this isolation continues over time, each subgroup will experience their own changes and random mutations, which will cause the two groups to evolve independently. Eventually, the two groups will have diverged so much that they are no longer reproductively compatible. Reproductive isolation can occur in a few ways. One of these ways is geographic isolation. This is when two populations from the same ancestral species get separated by some sort of geographical barrier, like a river or a mountain range. Over time, this physical barrier prevents the two populations from interbreeding and speciation occurs. This can be seen with antelope squirrels found on either side of the Grand Canyon in Arizona. At one point, these squirrels were all one species and were freely able to interbreed. Eventually, after the Colorado River carved out the Grand Canyon, two subgroups of this ancestral squirrel population were separated and ultimately evolved into the South Rim squirrel species and the North Rim squirrel species that are alive today. Another form of reproductive isolation is behavioral isolation. This occurs when the behavior between two subgroups, rather than some geographical physical boundary, prevents the two subgroups from interbreeding, ultimately allowing for speciation to occur. This can be seen in the blue-footed booby and the red-footed booby. At some point in their evolutionary history, the blue-footed booby and red-footed booby shared a common ancestor. Eventually, the females from the subgroup that would evolve to become the blue-footed boobies developed a preference for bluer feet and ultimately a different mating dance. This led to a reproductive barrier between the two subgroups, and eventually the two groups speciated into the birds that we are familiar with today. The final type of reproductive isolation that I wanted to discuss in this video was temporal isolation. This occurs when a difference in mating time or season leads to a lack of interbreeding between two populations. A commonly cited example of temporal isolation can be seen in two species of toad, the American toad and the Fowler's toad. Both toads occupy overlapping geographical regions, but the American toad mates in the early summer, while the Fowler toad mates in the late summer. This difference in mating season serves as a reproductive barrier that prevents the two from interbreeding, which has allowed speciation to occur. As a quick recap, a species can be defined as a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Speciation occurs when one species diverges into two or more species. Speciation occurs as a result of reproductive isolation, which for our purposes comes in three forms: geographical isolation, behavioral isolation, and temporal isolation. Geographical isolation occurs when some physical geographical boundary prevents two subgroups from interbreeding. Behavioral isolation occurs when some difference in courtship rituals or mating preference prevents two subgroups from interbreeding. And finally, temporal isolation occurs when two subgroups develop different mating seasons or times, leading to the divergence of the two species. That's it for this video. I hope it was helpful, and if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comment section below. Furthermore, if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos to come.